Our God in heaven, we do thank you for this time that we can all gather, and for people that are hearing this message and wanting to know more. We thank you that you love us all so very much, that you want us to have these truths to help us to understand where we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. I just pray for a special blessing today. I pray that you would be with all of us and help me to speak clearly and remember all the things that we've been taught. We thank you in your name, Jesus. Amen. Before I begin, I want to just take a quick moment to say a very warm welcome to my mum. She's her name is Liz. She's unable to join on Zoom today, but we've been speaking a lot about what we're learning in this movement. She was really interested in learning more, and she wants to see the presentation. So she'll be watching the recording. So we just want to say a very warm welcome to you, Liz, from all of us. So I just need to do that before I begin. So today's presentation, we're going to be looking at a camp meeting, and it's from Sacramento, California, and it was dated between the 25th and the 28th of December. And this is an introduction. So it's the first presentation, and it's titled Eden, Cana and Stonewall, and the date there, you can see it's on the 25th. So I've drawn up the priest line because when there is a camp meeting, it's really nice to know what you're talking about. Thanks, Chris. All right, so as I said, we're doing this camp meeting titled Eden, Cana and Stonewall, and we've got the priest line drawn up so that we can see where we are on the line. So when we look at the date 2021, this whole camp meeting is really important. And what was the significance of this whole camp meeting was this was to be the formalization of this dispensation, of this time period. So if we know where we are, we know what we're talking about and what periods. It's a formalization, and this is where we were in this time period. Okay, so before we dive into this review, because we have people that haven't heard a lot of our message and are joining us for the first time, I do want to bring a quick review of some important understandings we have in this movement to help, I guess, to help understand this presentation. So I've written a little list that we will go through. You see that list okay? Okay, so you can see the list okay. All right, so the first thing we want to have a look at is, through these presentations, we'll see how important history is. So we've got here the importance of history. And also another important thing, there needs to be the correct understanding of that history to begin with. So we need that correct history. So how important is history? So it is so important that God has established written language. So, you know, we've thousands of years have passed since written language was developed, and we have still got that history now today. So there's some really important lessons that God wants us to understand and to remember. So what we'll see is through these different histories, and I'm just going to draw a little, oh, actually I won't do that now. So what we'll see through these different histories is ways through history, through different time periods, that progressive ways of information can be spread. So information is important, and there needs to be some development how it's spread. So they're developed and they're harnessed to spread the gospel. Like say, instance, in the time of Moses, so we've got written language. In the time of Jesus, when Jesus was on earth, there was roads and there was shipping. We had peace in that time, so the message was able to get through. And the Protestant Reformation in that time period, there was the printing press that was developed. In the Millerite time period, we've got the railway and we've got the telegraph. So when we come to our time, in our period, up on the line here, we've got, for our reform line in our history here, we've got the World Wide Web is developed. So now we've got the ability to connect globally. It's not sort of local or national, it's globally, and we're able to share and gain a lot of information. And it helps, this information helps us to understand the external events that are happening. So in 2018, I'm just going to touch just on this for a little bit to help with understanding why we've got all these numbers and things up here, is the important thing that we learnt, we did learn in that time period, was there's what streams of information was correct and what resources or news sites that were to be trusted. So in this time period, it was a simple understanding of two news sites. So we looked at CNN and we looked at Fox. So if we think of Fox being a conservative news site, and they mainly would put out conspiracy theories. So we could see the differences between that. So it's developed and refined since then, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the idea is knowing what stream of information to go to. That was really important. So the correct stream of information. So that's another important aspect of this message. And that message really taught us that we needed to be media literate. If we're going to understand these present and future events, we needed to be media literate. So all the information that we're getting is mainly from the World Wide Web, and we're needing to know how to divide that truth and error. And we're not talking about YouTube clips and memes and comedians, and definitely we've been learning more about social influencers. So they're not what we're looking at. We're actually talking about journalism, and that's real journalism. So, and these have been developed through Vespers, and Vespers is a lot of studies that went through to develop more on these things. So we saw through that Vespers that we were on the right side of political and social issues, and we needed to move from the right to the left. So that was another thing that we need to understand. And we were taught that also, as it developed, that we needed to sift the articles from the left as well, because we saw that they actually had some problems as well. So knowing the correct history is important. If we understand that we need, the reason why is because we need to prophetically identify external events. So this is another important one. And I guess we have to prophetically identify what those events even look like. So if we're going to be looking at something external, before you can take any methodology to that external event, we need to have that understanding what that event even was. So what happened? So there's no point having good methodology if our ideas of external events are reading some kind of fantasy. So I guess what we need to understand why there are so many different views on the subject Elder Tess covers in this camp meeting is because I guess people go to the Bible and they, or even wider history, to prove an argument. A few things happen. People don't have the correct understanding of that history, that historical event to begin with. So they choose to ignore certain parts and take their biases to that history and interpret the history that way. So over the years, we've been shown what the right resources are to go to be taught the right answers and the methods to use. So when we have a good foundation of the importance of history and the correct understanding of that history, we also need to know how and what to apply to us as well. So I guess that's an importance of interpreting the Bible. So that's just a little review, some important ways that we've learnt to understand that there's actually another important one we need to understand is the wrong ways and the right ways of interpreting Bible history. So I guess what we need are guidelines, are rules to interpret the Bible. So another word that we use instead of rules is methodology. So I'm just going to write methodology up here. I'll just write it up here. Too many O's. Methodology, yeah. Thought I had too many O's. That's a methodology. So methodology is the correct method to unpack Bible and wider history. So when we go through this study today, we'll be able to see some of these methodologies that people have used to interpret and apply Bible verses. So another thing that happens that we'll be looking at today, and you might have had this experience with people that you talk to, even in your own experiences, a lot of people, what happens is they mostly disregard or ignore the interactions with other nations around these time periods. So that's why Elder Tess spends 6 presentations in this camp meeting of drawing out all the histories that are surrounding the nations and their interactions with God's people. So what are those nations doing around at that time? All right, so we said as we go through, I've got some more on the other side of the board to see as we go through, you'll see the different methodologies used. And I guess the reason why it's good to understand different methodologies is because there is implications, I guess, and those are how God has been misunderstood and misrepresented, and then that in turn people have suffered through history. So it's really important to have all these in place before you start applying anything. All right, so where are we? We're standing in 2023 now, and we need to know what methodology is for our time. So I'm going to write another little list, and it's just to compare and contrast, because this is some of the discussions I was having with Mum, Liz, about, and she'd never heard of these things because we were talking about why people do certain things, and they say they love God but then they hurt people. So I'm just going to rub this out and we'll have another list. Hope it rubs out. It's a good pen. All right, I'll leave that methodology up there and we can use that as our heading. All right. So the first methodology we want to have a look at is a thus saith the Lord. Now, something that we need to consider as we do discuss these methodologies is at certain times these methods did serve their purpose. So with the thus saith the Lord, if you're living in a time of a prophet, say in a time of Isaiah, and Isaiah's telling you, you know, God said this, they're talking to you now. So that applies to you. So that saith the Lord applies to you. So then you're going to be doing what that prophet's telling you, aren't you? So, but what if you're not living in that time of the prophets? So in that prophet. So that's what we want to have a little bit more of explore what that's like. So we'll put a list up here. I only have a small board, so I'm going to take up a lot of room over this side, I think. So we'll look at thus saith the Lord. And with a thus saith the Lord, there is, I'm just going to draw. Can you see that line, Chris? Yep. Okay. Now, with a thus saith the Lord, what happens? It literally happened, which is fine. It literally happened, but what people tend to do is it literally happened, and then they're going to apply it literally again. So just to give you a little bit of a line here. So if we see history on this line, it's not a reform line, it's just an example. So we've got, just say there's Moses's time. Then we've got the time that Jesus was here. And another time period, and then down here we've got, there's us. This is us here. So with the thus saith the Lord, what happens is that if it happened in Moses' time, it literally happened, which is fine, but then people tend to literally take that literal time, literal event, and then want to apply it in different time periods. So it literally happened here, and they literally want to apply it in another time period. So I guess this is about application. So they want to, it literally happened here, they want to apply it here and here. So we're going to just do a little contrast with what we use a lot in this movement is parables. So with parables, right, parables up here. So with the thus saith the Lord, I forgot to write here, it's a literal, it literally happened, and we're going to literally apply it again. With parables, it's different. So yes, it literally happened here, but then there is, the application becomes a spiritual. So or we say symbolic as well. So it literally happened here, but now what's a spiritual, what's a symbolic application here? So literal to spiritual. Let's get this, I'm the worst speller. Ritual, all symbolic. So it literally happened here, and then what does it mean symbolically or spiritually in the other time periods? So take a drink of water, sorry. All right. So we're doing a little compare and contrast at this moment about a parable, a literal to spiritual, and a thus saith the Lord, a literal to literal. So that there's many examples in the Bible that we can pull out, but just this one, actually, my mum and I were talking about, was in Jesus's time. So when they bring the woman found in adultery, they're dragging her in before Jesus in the crowd, and they're calling out, stone her, stone her. And they're saying, now Moses said in commanded to us that such should be stoned. So there's a law back in Moses's time, and they're wanting to apply it in Jesus's time period. It's another time period, another dispensation, but they're bringing it into their time. So, and Jesus is saying, well, why are you still stoning people? You're meant to progress. So this is this literal. Jesus spoke in parables, and Jesus wanted to teach what the spiritual lessons were, to understand. He wasn't getting rid of the law. He was trying to, progress and show them what the symbolic application was. So for Jesus in Jesus' time, stones, literal stones in Moses's time, when we think about in Jesus's time, it looked different. Stoning looked different. Stoning, talking to Elder Terry the other day, could be words, truths, convicting them of their sins. So the stones were words casting truth, not literal stones. These words were supposed to change their minds and their hearts. And we know that they chose not to listen. When Jesus spoke to the woman, with words, his words changed her heart and her mind. So that's just a quick example of how we can do a little compare and contrast on these. So if we think of the parables, the spiritual application and the original meaning, so it's progress. So the great thing about parable teaching, it does teach you about progression. So I'm not sure what I'll do. So it teaches you about progression. So we're understanding more that, we're going from Eden to Eden, we're progressing. And when we hold on to this literal to literal, we're essentially regressing. So regressing means returning to a former or a lesser state. So we're regressing, we're going back. And what happens, you'll find that a lot of traditions and customs from different time periods seem to continue as well. But okay, what do we got there? Another one we want to have a look at and is proof texting, but proof texting only. As I said before, there was times that these methodologies were used, and that was for their time period. So when we think of, say, the Millerites, there was this proof texting was one way to help them to come out of Protestantism. So Miller was able, with his proof texting and also his rules of interpretation. Sorry, lost my mind then. So you've got Miller was able to unlock Daniel and the 2300 days using this proof texting method, connected Daniel 8 and 9 to Leviticus and 2 Thessalonians. So back then, this was their way of progressing and helping their understandings. So for us, if we were using this now, what it means is, in your Bible, you would take a verse from, from back in this time period, and then you would take a verse from, this time period. And what happens is, to have an argument, make an argument, biblical argument, but what's happening is you're actually ignoring a whole lot of history and historical context. And we saw from that list that was really important to have. So, we need to know, who are they speaking to? What time is this all taking place, and where? What are the other nations? How are they interacting with God's people at that time? What's the social, political, cultural setting at that time? And another one that I remember learning this one, and I didn't even, it's something, when you learn it, you can't unlearn it. So it was, when you look at a verse, what are all the other verses saying around, what's all the chapters saying around that text? So you can't just pull out sort of, a sentence here and there and then, apply or interpret and apply that. So what happens with the proof texting, so proof texting only, what happens is you end up ignoring history. And you will take things out of context. So I'll put these on the, and what happens is, and this method suits if you have a bias, right? So you're picking and choosing to find a text that will suit your worldview, and you're ignoring all the texts. So what happens with this methodology is it's not consistent. So you've got this inconsistency. I'll just write it up here. You've got this inconsistency. And ultimately, if you're always going back and using these methods to apply it to today, so you're regressing, and there's no moving forward towards Eden, because moving forwards is the only way that humans are going to be restored. So there's no restoration in this. So if we jump back to parables, this shows us progression. So from Eden to Eden, restoring and preparing us for a new earth. So that is going to show us restoring. Another thing that we always look at is dispensations. So what's happening? Certain times applied at certain events. Certain events are applied at certain time periods. So who are they speaking to? What time is this taking place, and where? So you really need to know that time period, that dispensation. Historical context. So what's happening at that time? And like we said, who are they talking to? So historical context. It does show you the social and political and the cultural climate, who's interacting with God's people at that time. And we know that, with God's people, there's God's leading them through all these time periods, but we know that there's two stories of this history. There's a lot of, the Bible's full of all the different nations around them. So, and they're really, really valuable for us to understand. So if we think of, wrong methodology is just going to bring about wrong application. So with parables, we know there is restoration. And parables help us get there. So with parables, we have a lot of tools in our parable tool bag. It really helps us to unpack the texts and the wider history. And we've just done like a little parable. It was a compare and contrast. We have repeat and enlarge, and then from the beginning. There's lots, but also is important is having structures. So like this reform line that we have got up, there's repeating patterns. You'll see there's repeating patterns in here. So we have a message that comes. I'll do it on this one because this is what we're talking about. We have a message that comes. I've just lost mine. What's before? Increase of knowledge. Sorry. A message comes, increase of knowledge, formalization, and then you test it on it. So you can see that repeating pattern, and parables help us to know where to place all these. So we can safely place things, what have happened. So internal and external history, past, present, and future events. So it's really important how important actually parables are. So, and it helps us to make a correct application. So with all that stuff, I'm just going to rub this off just really quickly. I need this space again. The joys of having a small book. All right, so in this study, we're going to be looking at a few topics, and we're going to be looking at racism and slavery, and about gender, which we're going to be looking at sexism, headship, and patriarchy, and the important one is about homosexuality as well. So that's the topics we'll be covering in this presentation. As soon as I get this board clean. Oof. Quite tricky. All right, that's as good as it's going to get. All right. So what we might do while this priest line is up is actually to have a look at some of the external and internal events and how they interact. So we need to see on this line how the external does affect the internal. So what I mean is external things happening and how is it affecting us internally in this movement. So so we'll just start from 2015, just from in here. So there's some significant events that's happening externally. So the external event that was happening in 2015 was gay marriage. And we looked at civil marriage and realised that the allowance for gay civil marriage in 2015 was correct. So this is a correct understanding. So internally, what was a significant event that was happening was women's ordination within Adventism. So women should have been ordained. The women's ordination should have taken place. So it was blocked, and it was blocked by a socially conservative faction at the Adventist conference. So we can see the internal, external interacting here. In 2018, we touched on this before, the controversy was over these two streams of information. So this is externally happening, and we needed to understand the external events from media. So we had to understand that there was two streams of media in the first place, and we said it was a simplification back in 2018 that there was CNN and Fox, and internally, I guess, these external events we need to know were prophetic. So there was also our mindsets too. We were on the right side of the issues, and we needed to move to the left. So it was simple for this dispensation, for this time period. And since Vespers, this has been refined because we know it's not so simple, and we know that we have to sift the left side media as well, because we've seen that they've got some problems too. So there's always a development. So in 2019, we have an increase of knowledge on the Sunday law. So when we saw Elder Tess do, we saw the Eden to Eden drawn out. I think it was in the line of restoration, and she really broke down and explained and did the compare and contrast between racism and sexism. So we saw that the Sunday law is about gender. It's not about Sunday and Sabbath issue. 2020, this time period was a whole lot of external history. It was amazing, the presentation. So Elder Tess showed there was 90% of history through these presentations, and it was about the external influences of pagan nations through ancient Israel, and the 10% was applying to us. So we can see the internal, external there, and how that affected us internally. It was a profound study of the Apis bull, and a lot of reasons, but I guess one stood out for me was seeing the true character of God and God's kingdom, and I'd never seen it like that before. And it's, if you haven't seen the Apis bull from Elder Tess, I'd highly recommend that as well. So continuing on to 2021, this camp meeting is going to be looking at the same thing, all external history. That's why we need to know why history is so important. All right. So Elder Tess does start off the presentation with a quote, and she starts off with a question and a quote, and she asks the question, where did Adventism go wrong? So she's talking about present day Adventism, and what is it that Adventism does so wrong that's left them in 2021 essentially blind to where they are prophetically? So I'm going to read this. It's from the Review and Herald. In reviewing our past history, having travelled over every step in advance to our present standing, I say, praise God. As I see what God has wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as leader. We had nothing to fear for the future, except as we forget the way the Lord has led us with his teachings in our past history. So where did Adventism go wrong? They forgot history. So we need to see how important this history is, because when you understand the past and you understand history, you've got nothing to fear for the future, and we don't forget the way that God has led us. So knowing all this results in knowing where you are prophetically, where we are prophetically now. So I'm just going to draw a diagram up. So I'll just do this for a moment. I like to have visuals. It's good to see what we're talking about. So we've got ancient Israel. I'll just put it AI. And then we've got modern Israel. And we've got the beginning, so the Alpha and the end of ancient Israel. And then we've got modern Israel, the Alpha is the beginning, and the end, the Omega. So Jesus' time, so we know what that is. This is the period today. And Millerites. This is a time at a, I'm just going to put these over a little bit. Ancient Israel and modern Israel. Oops. Okay, and this is the time period of the golden calf. All right. So just to walk us through to see how history does impact us. If we think of this, we can't understand Adventism today without understanding the end of ancient Israel. We cannot understand the end of ancient Israel unless we understand where they went wrong at the beginning of ancient Israel. So we can't understand this golden calf unless we don't understand paganism, pagan Egypt and their Apis bull. I'm just talking about that Apis bull study. So then we can't understand Adventism, how it's imbibed Protestantism, unless we understand that Protestant history, where Protestant and the Reformation went wrong. All right, so we can see all these are connected. We can see that we need to understand these histories, and then also what's happening on the external history, so that we can see they're all connected. So I guess the implications, when we look back and we see the past correctly, it has massive implications of how we view the present and what we do expect for the future. So in the Old Testament, the history of God's people is not just the history, of God's people, but the history of paganism and how that's interacting with their history. And the same, we're looking at modern Israel and the Millerites. And externally, we can see the Protestants and how they're interacting with Adventism. So ancient Israel is encoded in the Old Testament, and God recognises this importance of us tracing this history, because, as we said, He's put it all in writing. So we've got nothing to fear for the future if we forget how God has led us. And we know there is two stories as well, because we've got, it's not just this pretty picture of God. leading, these people. There's the ugly side of a rebellious people that God is trying to restore. So in ancient Israel, as well as modern Israel, we've got two streams of information as well. All right, and I guess this is really important, because as we go through these subjects from this camp meeting, the reason why so many people have different views on the subjects that we're going to be talking about it is because they're ignoring a lot of history and they're taking their biases in interpreting that history. So I'm just going to flip the board. So I've already drawn up the lines for time. Okay, just getting a time check. So before we do walk through this history, before we walk through this Eden to Eden history, I do want to touch on something. It was from a presentation by Elder Terry, and it really helped me understand why with Eve, we think of Eve, and Jacoby was talking about it, was why that sin had to result in patriarchy, and just hearing the devastation of how women and children have suffered, listening to what's happening in different parts of the world and different states. So we know God would have dealt with this sin problem another way. So where did all this come from? And I don't want to simplify these presentations that Elder Terry has done. It's a must-see. There's part 1 and part 2 of the Tower of Babel, it's called. And I highly recommend watching those as well. So one part that I do want to bring out from Elder Terry's presentation is she's talking about the daily, and we mark, the daily or paganism when they're starting to tread down God's people, and we on a line, we see that in 723 BC. But what Elder Terry shows is we can trace that right back to heaven. So this is the ideology that began in the mind of Satan. So we're going to take a step back for a little moment and have a look at this. So we're taking a step back into heaven. Much room there. And Elder Terry talks about I'm just going to bring out a little bit. So Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, and it's the mind of Lucifer in heaven. So one of them says, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So if we think of what that mindset is, this is self-exaltation and self-promotion that he had in heaven. And so that daily we can trace all the way back to heaven. So I'll just write this down here. So self-exaltation, and then you have self-promotion. And I'll explain how that's all connected. So the paganism we can trace back. So it's continued since Lucifer's fall, and it's brought down to earth. And then it's transferred that to Adam and Eve. And he's saying, you shall be as gods. So this self-promotion, self-exaltation, and they've bought into it. And now we see that's how sin has entered earth, entered the world. So we see this new religion, it's developed and it's here on earth. because there are problems now and they need to be solved, and they're not doing it God's way. So it's in the solving of these problems that we see this deterioration of affairs between people on earth. So with Eve, what's the problem? The problem is Eve, she's wandering. So it's a wandering Eve. What are you going to do to solve the problem of wandering Eves? So the solution is patriarchy. Our wandering Eves caused this in the first place. So now we have patriarchy. It's going to solve the problem. It doesn't start straight away, but that's how it's going to be dealt with. With Cain, you've got the problem of religious intolerance. So how do you solve that problem? With more intolerance. So there's you can trace back where the church and state relationship starts back with Cain. And Ham, you've got the problem with Ham. How are you going to solve that? And it's by racism. So it's the result. These problems could have been solved another way, but they're being solved through self-exaltation and self-promotion. So how are we going to solve this Eve problem? Man exalts himself over woman, patriarchy. Ham, one nation will exalt themselves over another nation and then bring them into captivity and servitude. So that's slavery. So self-exaltation, self-promotion has been brought down from Satan to earth. So now we know where the beginning of this is. And as we run through the lines, we can see it's continued. Well, it's come down, and then we can see Abraham, he was a slave owner. And then you get to Leviticus, and portion to you to enslave people around you and rule over them. So this is, we can see the Alpha and Omega of ancient Israel. So this is the first, is my phone okay? Is it on? Oh, okay. Am I back on? I think that's, yeah. Is it right? Sorry, when someone rings, the internet cuts out. So this is the institutionalization of slavery at the beginning of ancient Israel. We get to look at Deuteronomy. So we're all familiar with Deuteronomy, but I'll do a bit more a review. So Deuteronomy 22 talks about, I'll actually read the verse. So the woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do an abomination unto the Lord thy God. So if we think about all what we're learning about the importance of history and the correct history, the original context of that verse is not talking about clothes. And the reason why is because we know they all wore the same thing. So it's nothing to do with their clothing. The original context of that verse is the issue of gender roles. So we can see here that they weren't meant to break down gender roles. As we keep continuing, we see Solomon, there's more slavery. We know his position on women. And then we come to the Omega history. So under Leviticus, and Israelites and non-Israelites were to be treated different, and only men went into covenant. And that changes a little bit in the next history, in the Omega history, when they're all treated the same. And we know we get that from Galatians. I'm just thinking for time, I'll keep going. And Elder Test does say that that Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male or female, for ye are all in Christ Jesus. So that's that definition of female male is very, very narrow. So she was saying liberal Adventists use this to dismantle some things today. But we know when we continue that they say that there's no headship after this, but clearly there is, because when you come to Ephesians 5 and 6, you've got headship, in 5, headships reinforced and slavery is reinforced. So when things are all so messed up, God has to start again. So we come to the time of the end. This is another reform line, and he's going to try and correct in this history. And when we think of, so if we've come here, so then we're going to work backwards from here. So we've gone 1, 2, 3. So Eve, Cain, and Ham, and now we're going backwards. So 3, 2, 1. So racism in the Millerite time history, that was their test. Worship in the 1888 history, that was their test. And gender and patriarchy are our test. So much of what we've understood about gender has come from a compare and contrast of issue number 1 and 3. So Elder Tess makes that point. If you're going to ignore Leviticus 23, then you need to really consider your position on Deuteronomy 22. So if you want to reject racism, then you need to reject sexism as well. So when we do come down to 1798, slavery is still being practiced, and you know why. What are people doing? So one thing is, we can see from that list, that compare and contrast on the different methodologies. This is one that we can sort of have a look at. So the Protestant churches in the South are defending slavery by using the Bible passages, and they're going, such as, so Abraham kept slaves, God instructed them how to keep slaves and who were they to enslave, and then Solomon about keeping slaves, as God ordered. And when it talks about Paul telling slaves to go back to their masters and submit, and in that same chapter, when he's telling slaves to go back to their masters to submit, he's telling women to submit to their husbands. So you come to 1798, and they're using this methodology of, it's literally happened here, so we're literally going to be applying it to our time as well. And in the 1850s, what does Ellen White do? Without any explanation, she throws away all this, thus saith the Lord's, and she calls slavery an enormous and grievous sin. She actually compares what the slaveholders are doing to their fellow men to what the papists did to Christ followers. So she says it is more tolerable for the heathen and for the papists in the day of the execution of God's judgment than for such men, so for the slave owners. So Ellen White understands the cruelty upon humans, and it's a grievous sin. All right, so that was their test for that time, was about slavery, so racism. When you think of, we'll just touch on Cain quickly. This is a fight over worship and discarding of the Sabbath began with Cain. But when it comes to gender in our history, we know the understanding is we still hold on to worship. All right. I'm just going to do a quick time check, if that's okay. Just want to have a look at what else I can bring in. All right. So a few things that Elder Tess does bring out, that when we're talking about these key reformatory movements, is when you're uncovering all these time spans, to really see how hard the work is for God to undo all these three sins that were introduced. So that's one thing that stood out to me is, these things, now how's God going to restore us to help us? So this is so important, the time period that we're living in. It's profound, actually. All right, I'm just going to skip a little bit from my notes just for time. All right. So we've got this 6,000 years of progression and education, and it's helping us to understand the character of God, and we need to have those, to follow those rules to know what that progression was meant to be as well. So understanding Adventism, not just Adventism, but Protestantism has a profound impact on how we see the present and the future. And we've learned it's not just that history. We're really wanting to understand ancient Israel and external nations that dominated that biblical history. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. I hope I've got enough room. Okay. All right. So we're looking at the internal, but what we want to have a look at is external. So what are the external superpowers in this history? So this is really important part of the study too. So I'm going to write them down. So, and they're not drawn to scale. So we've got Assyria, Mesopotamia, and then we've got Egypt, and then we've got Babylon, Greece, and then Rome. Oops, didn't all fit in there. We need to squash it down a little bit. All right. So we see this is when the Old Testament starts to be written, and then we can see here when it's completed. So for the writings of these books, we can see the external superpowers and how they're interacting. Maybe I can highlight it a bit, how they're interacting with God's people. So these histories are what Elder Test goes into this whole camp meeting. So the next 6 presentations. And it's good just to have some sort of visual to see where they are on these lines. All right, another line that she does bring in is down the bottom here. Just get my notes. And what we want to have a look at is, so when we do look at ancient Israel, what can they tell us about modern Israel? So ancient and the modern. So the ancient Israel events are on the top here, and modern Israel are on the bottom down here. So I'll just walk through this one. So we've got the work of John and then Elder Jeff. Got baptism, the first temple cleansing, and we can see this change in leadership. We've got Christ and the parables, triumphal entry, and for us we've got the midnight cry, the pain of the cross, and beginning the time of trouble and the harvest for the disciples. So what this line warns you about is that when you get to here, to Pentecost, the end of ancient Israel tells you that as a priest, you still don't understand the implications of this message. You still don't know the implications of the parables. So I can draw that. Oops, sorry, too far. We don't understand the implication of parables. So under the formalization of the harvest, which is finally was laid out here, is understood in its completeness. So there are things, there are three things in this history that she wants us to understand. So at Pentecost, in that time period in Pentecost, the disciples finally understand. So at Pentecost, disciples understand. So point number 2, the theme of this history is about gender. And the test for God's people when it comes to race was, we can see it's here in the Millerite time period, and the Sabbath, 1888, that was their test. And we're still expected to hold on to these 2 and 3. But the final test that comes to God's people is gender. So this history, where are we? This history is all about gender. If we take Christ as a priest, we understand 30 years. So 30 years, but then he doesn't go to work, sorry, until the end of the 30 years, because he's not ready yet. So if we think of Christ here, so it's 30 years. Oops, got to go through all there. Because he still needs to be tested and trained by the experience of the wilderness. And then when he gets to Cana, I've written it down here, and then he needs Cana. So we know that the formalization of this message is a subject of gender combined with the subject of marriage. Here. A final point that Elder Tess brought out was from Portugal 2020, to prepare God's people for 1989. There were 3 external movements, like major movements, and this was to prepare modern Israel for what, not just modern Israel, actually for the whole world, for the whole entire world. So these external movements, the first one was the civil rights, so just in here. So there's 1989 here. So there's 3 significant things. So I just lost my notes. Oh, yep. It's hiding. So the 3 external events that were really significant. So first one was the civil rights movement. So that's them there. The civil rights. And then the second was second wave feminism. Sorry about the small writing. And the third we're going to have a look at Stonewall. And that began in 1969. So racism's been looked at in great detail. And the second wave feminism has been covered, but there's still much more to learn. So Elder Tess does say that, we'll be talking about this until the second Advent, and then you're going to have to talk to Abraham, and you'll get to heaven and have no idea what's going on. So there's still so much more to learn about that. The third movement was Stonewall, which began in 1969, and that was at the Stonewall on June the 28th. And if you're not too sure about that period, that what happened, then you can Google it and have a look. It's pretty horrific what happened. But this was beginning the fights for the LGBT rights. It was mostly the rights on the civil rights around homosexuality. So these three, so pre-1989, these three movements led to events of this history, and especially second wave feminism and Stonewall. So all the fights that occurred since 1989 over gender. And that third one at Stonewall, we want to have a look at Stonewall with the formalisation as a symbol. So everything that surrounds the LGBTQ I plus movements and their rights. So the elements have been taught in this movement, but not in great detail. So that point number 3 has never formally been tackled until now, until Elder Tess has done all this camp meeting. So this camp meeting, as we said, it's a whole lot of history, and you're all threading the waymarks of the movement with a theme of gay marriage. So it's a really important, I hope to continue presenting on that as well. So she goes into paganism and with that same theme. So she addresses Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Greece and Rome. And I'm just looking at the time, so I might just do a quick summary and then just one point, a few points just before I summarise, if that's okay. So when we're talking about homosexuality, we know that this is not a mental illness. It's not an issue of hormones. It's not a choice. So Elder Tess is not going to be going into that at the next presentation. So it's just like many people are born heterosexual, they're born homosexual, and people that may not like hearing that or don't agree with that may be looking for some sort of evidence. So it's a little difficult to prove psychologically that the physical nature of homosexuality, but then I guess that answer is we'll prove what makes someone heterosexual, and no one can. So there's no gene locator that makes you attracted to someone or the opposite sex. So we've gone through the gendered brain, and one thing, the amazing information about how our brain works, and what is even more amazing is how much in the past it's been misunderstood. So and we can see how twisted and manipulated that science has been for many generations, and we still don't know a great deal about the brain. So we're learning, but Elder Tess is not going to go in the presentations to prove what makes someone homosexual. So she says she has no idea how people fall in love. So what science makes people fall head over heels or cause physical attraction, even disconnected from homosexuality. So there's a lot we don't understand, but the majority of scientific community, those who do know what they are talking about today, the vast majority know that homosexuality is not some kind of choice. So just to quickly summarize what we went through, so we saw where we were, where this camp meeting was, and it's in that last year's presentation on the priest line. We saw from that list the importance of history and the correct history. We did a little compare and contrast from the methodologies, and how interpreting the Bible, and also really important how when we've got the methodology, how to correctly apply them. We saw that how Adventism is prophetically blind because they've forgotten the history. And I guess when we look at that formalization, I keep saying that word wrong, the harvest had to be understood because there's no new message. It's always been here, and that is related to gender, and this is what's going to lead up to the Sunday law. And we saw about Cana. Where are you, Cana? Had to be about marriage, and that can also addresses the LGBTQ homosexuality and a fight for gay marriage. So, and we were taught in 2015 how that gay marriage was correct. All right. Sorry, I sped through that last bit there. But what we'll do is we'll close in prayer. And if you've got any questions, I just ask if you would kneel with me now or bow your heads. All right, let's pray. Dear God, we do thank you so much for helping us to have an idea of not just our history, but all the histories that's surrounded God's people, that helps us to understand why things are the way they are now, and what we are looking for in the future. We do thank you for all the ways that you've taught us, and we just pray that we would continually want to hear more and learn more, and to be changed into your likeness. We thank you for everybody that's here, and we just pray for a blessing on the rest of today, on this Sabbath day. We thank you in your name, Jesus. Amen. So thank you everybody for joining. And yeah, I hope, Mum, you enjoy this, everything that we've been talking about, and I hope it's a bit clearer. I'm sure you've got some questions. So thank you, everybody.